Folk City truly was a family business. Very few unrelated outsiders worked there. One of my relatives wound up being part of its folklore as well as part owner. Mike's younger brother, my Uncle John Porco, didn't speak English as well as Mike, and you might say was more brawn than brains.
Do you remember John?
Of course, yeah.
Brother John, sure.
Tell me about John.
Yeah, they loved music, they loved people.
They really did.
They were always warm.
He was like the backbone, the quiet one. And everybody knew Mike. Not everybody knew John.
Well, for them to come down and do an avant-garde, they were way out of the box, man.
good point.
Sends up a water. No fear.
You know, he didn't interact with everybody like Mike did. I mean, they were both like family to me.
John Porco was a really nice guy, and he was very nice to all of the musicians. He didn't have to deal with us on a business level.
I love John. If somebody needed to get the iron bar behind the bar, you know, conk somebody on the head if they're causing danger to other people, he was the guy. He was the muscle there. You could tell they were a team.
Another fine fellow. He genuinely loved musicians too.
I grew up at a time when nobody in their right mind would become a folk singer for a living. It wasn't something you dreamed of as a career. It was something you thought you might do with your friends after you got back from a real job. And of course, I've been doing it ever since for the last 50 years, you know.
At a certain point, places like Gerde's Folk City and the Bitter End and the Village Gate became kind of a feeding frenzy of people wanting to get discovered. Because there was Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul and Mary and Judy Collins and all these people that were suddenly big commercial entities way beyond what anybody would have assumed before that. Before we were just kind of playing for ourselves and for the beauty of the music.
People would ask me, they think you know something because you've been around long enough, you know, and they'd say, Arlo, what do I have to do to be a musician? And I say, what else are you doing? And then they give me the list of what they were doing. They're either going to school or they got a job. I say, if you want to be a musician, quit doing everything else. And if you starve to death, you will have starved to death a musician.
If you want to be in a music scene, if you want to interact with other musicians and learn from other musicians, you got to be on that scene. You go out and you physically hang out in the club. Community of a couple of dozen, you know, or more people that are good, talented people and have something to offer, you're going to have a scene in that club because the musicians are willing. It was a fun place to play. It was a great place to learn. I think that the reason that there are so many Folk City alumni out there still working as professional singer-songwriters is because it was a great place to learn your craft.
We just kept at our thing. We kept at our craft. That's the thing. We thought it was a craft. We went after it. A lot of us are still doing it.
We used to call Folk City the port of entry. It was like everybody's first real gig in New York. They almost wouldn't hire you until you said you'd played somewhere else first. But Mike didn't care about that. He'd never ask you, where else have you played? He fostered, really did foster the greatest level of creativity that you could get. Because you played your own songs in Folk City. You didn't walk in there and play covers, ever. I don't know what you could ever ask beyond that of a club owner. Here's the cool thing about Mike. He realized that having the singers hang around at his bar was actually good for business, that the customers liked to socialize with the young singers. So when I would walk in there and say, can I have a beer? He'd look me right in the eye and say, you can't afford to drink here because I know what I pay you last time you played here, which wouldn't be a lot. And then he'd hand me a beer. And it would always be the cheapest beer that he had. It was marginally drinkable and pretty cheap at the time.
We were in there every night and everybody was drinking beer and, you know, having a good time, like a party kind of thing.
And guys would be buying you drinks and you'd be just hanging around and you'd be kind of socializing with everybody. It worked all the way around because it built the crowd up. The people that were the regulars that weren't musicians would get to know you a little bit personally and maybe they'd come back and see you when you played.
He was the bartender, I was the waitress.
His experience with Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel and people like that were that it didn't matter where else you played. What mattered was could you get on stage and you know, hold an audience and bring people back.
There it is. There was this transition from the old ballads that were, you know, about highway robbery or whatever, or love gone bad. Most of these songs were anonymously written. Nobody knew who wrote them, but people just contributed to them as they moved around. People would add a verse or something like that. For the most part, my father and his friends recorded these kinds of songs. These were the ones everybody knew. My dad would also write songs, but that was sort of a new thing. You gotta remember, 1961, there's only 50 years of recorded music. And people used the old tunes, even took some of the old songs and just changed them minutely. And Bob Dylan was a master at this, as my father had been. These guys just stole everything and recreated it, repackaged it, and people liked it.
The Gerdes scene was certainly Van Ronk was there with some regularity. Bob Dylan was around, because one of the things that I found when I came back to New York in 1961 was the buzz about this kid Dylan. Everybody was talking about it. What amazes me is that at that time he hadn't started to write songs yet.
Bob Dylan was one of the most dynamic performers that I'd ever seen.
And it's funny, in the beginning, I didn't get much impression of him. I didn't say, oh, this guy's going to be a star. It was just another person that came in and performed. And a few people liked him. They started to call my attention to him. And as he kept coming in, I paid more attention to him. And I noticed that he wasn't a really great singer, but his songs used to penetrate.
And the only song I can remember he wrote, it was one or maybe two talking blues. Talking Bear Mountain was one of them. There was probably another one.
Every so often, he'd say, hey man, we got to get together, we got to do something someday. And people always say that in the music business, and yeah, sure, it'd be nice, you know, and you take it with a grain of salt, but very unlikely that it ever happens. One day he just called me, just like that, man.
Bob was in town recording Desire, and he was also assembling the troops for the Rolling Thunder tour.
He'd been trying to record the Desire album and it wasn't working out. To my surprise, Bob asked my opinion. He said, what would you do if this was your record? How could you write this sinking ship? We went in with a smaller group and did the album basically in a night. One night.
One night I came to Folk City to see Sammy Walker. I look in the audience and there's my old friend Roger McGuinn from the Byrds. You never knew who you'd run into at Folk City. It was like this great frat club for the whole music scene. Later that night, I think we went to Chinatown. Then I said, hey, you know, I hear Bob's been hanging around in the Village a lot.